Hello again, friends, and welcome to Madison BookBeat, your listener-sponsored community radio home for Madison authors, Madison topics, Madison book events, and Madison publishers. I'm your host, Stu Levitan. Our guest this hour is Matthew Levin, who scores a trifecta. He's a PhD from the UW and author of Cold War University, Madison and the New Left in the 60s, from our friends at the University of Wisconsin Press. As to the topic, in the 1960s, the University of Wisconsin was one of the 4 or 5 most important campuses for both anti-war and civil rights activism. As portrayed on the cover of Cold War University, it was at the UW in May 1966 that hundreds, at times thousands of students peacefully occupied the administration building for a week in a popular protest against university compliance with the military draft. It was at the UW Stock Pavilion just 5 months later that a handful from the Committee to End the War in Vietnam heckled Senator Edward Kennedy so relentlessly that he left the stage. It was at the University of Wisconsin in February 1967 that hundreds of students occupied the offices of the president and the chancellor while they were inside. It was at the University of Wisconsin on October 18, 1967, the Battle of Dow, that American police for the first time used tear gas to quell an on-campus anti-war demonstration. And it was at the University of Wisconsin on 3:42 in the morning of August 24th, 1970, that the first fatal anti-war bombing took place. The New Year's Gang's attempted destruction of the Army Mathematics Research Center in Sterling Hall, which killed physics researcher and graduate student Robert Fassnacht. In fact, Madison's importance even predates the 60s. For a time in the early 1950s, the UW was the only campus in the country where the Communist Party's Youth Labor League was still allowed to operate. It was at the UW in 1959 that a group of graduate students started the journal Studies on the Left, almost 3 years before the Students for a Democratic Society adopted the Port Huron Statement. And it was Studies on the Left, not the Port Huron Statement, that would successfully define the New Left's relationship with liberalism. Studies on the Left even had a major impact on race relations, publishing a 1962 essay that inspired Huey P. Newton and others to form the organizations that was a forerunner to the Black Panther Party, one of many examples of the UW's significance in civil rights. UW students were among the nation's first in February 1960 to picket local chain stores in support of the lunch counter sit-in movement sweeping the South. In the summer of '61, UW students joined the Freedom Riders, and some were jailed at Parchman Farm. In early 1964, UW students were part of the sit-in at the Sears department store, conducted by the Congress of Racial Equality. A few months later, other students participated in Freedom Summer, registering voters in Mississippi and Tennessee, and starting an extraordinary collection of documents now held by the Wisconsin Historical Society archives. In March 1965, UW students joined the march from Selma to Montgomery. And in February 1969, Black students coordinated the decade's most successful political protest, the strike that led to a full degree-granting Department of Afro-American Studies. It is quite a history, historic at times, and Matthew Levin lays it out with precision and perspective in Cold War University, Madison and the New Left in the 60s. The editor of the first book about Madison and the New Left agrees. Paul Buell, editor of History in the New Left, Madison, Wisconsin, 1950 to 1970, and the journal Radical America, says Levin has done a masterful job, and that he has. Speaking personally, I know that when I was researching my book on Madison in the 60s, I relied very heavily on Cold War University for insight and accuracy and some really good endnotes. As to Matthew Levin, he was born and raised in Seattle, came to Madison in 1998 for graduate work in the UW's nationally renowned history department, which obviously worked out well because his doctoral dissertation, The 60s and the Cold War University, Madison, Wisconsin, and the Development of the New Left, essentially became the first draft of this book. His main gig now is teaching history at McFarland High School, where he is also the faculty advisor to the Model United Nations. He also volunteers at local food pantries and GSAFE, the Gay Straight Alliance for Safe Schools. It is a pleasure to welcome to Madison BookBeat my friend, Dr. Matthew Levin.
Thanks, Stu, for the kind words. And for giving us such a thorough timeline of events in the 60s, right?
I'm sorry, I was replugging. You'll have to say that again.
I was just thanking you for the kind words. Appreciate the introduction.
Thank you. I really can't thank you enough for the book. It really was an exceptionally useful thing for me to have when I was researching it, and it is an important contribution to the literature. We should note that we are speaking on June 1st, the morning after a very bad weekend, both downtown and across the country. To be perfectly honest, I'm not sure if talking about the 60s is really timely or totally irrelevant. What do you think? Are there things that today's protesters can learn from the 60s, or is the world today just too weird for any lessons of the past to apply?
That's a great question. I mean, of course, I'm sure you and many of your listeners are aware of the connections and the overlaps and the kind of bridges between the 60s and today, and what's happening in downtown Madison and in other cities across the country in the last few days. Whether the 60s hold any lessons is a tougher question. You know, that one we might have to wait a little bit on, but there's definitely some interesting connections. I mean, I was kind of thinking about this a little bit this morning before we connected on air, and just thinking back to the description of some of the discussions that happened in 1965, 66, 67, as students struggled with how do we make change? How do we kind of combat a system that is set up to serve different interests than what we want to see? And you know, there were all kinds of answers to that question, and you saw students engage in all kinds of different attempts to rework the culture and the politics around them. Some of them more successful than others. Those who engaged in the most confrontational tactics, I mean, it's questionable how successful they were ultimately, right? So I don't know. It's really hard to say what lessons we can take other than kind of pointing to some of the connections that are kind of obvious.
It's interesting. You looked at the 65, 66, 67 start of the period. I look at the 68, 69, 70 period, and the lesson I take is that the empire will always strike back, and that resistance leads to repression, and there's an ever-escalating, almost self-fulfilling vicious circle. And in the 60s, that manifested itself through simple things like restrictions on demonstrations or restrictions on student life or cuts to out-of-state enrollment. But today, it's armed personnel carriers in the streets of our cities and talk about the 101st Airborne Division. And, you know, there's the empire does always strike back. And
that's a good point. That's a good point. Although the events of the 60s are so different in some ways because they took place over years in spurts, right? I mean, there wasn't destruction, there wasn't arson on a daily basis, but it took place over the course of years. So it allowed the empire, as you say, to kind of formulate a response to dig in some ways. I'm not sure that that's going to be the case. I guess we'll have to see and find out, but I'm not sure that's going to be the case today, where I think the protests have at least created some movement among local and state and maybe even national political figures for examining what's at the root of this. Now, if this goes on a while, I'm sure you're right. I'm sure that there will be a significant repression and such. But yeah, we're still so early. It's hard to say.
As they say on TV, one thing's for certain, only time will tell. Back to you in the studio, Ted. So, Cold War University. One of your key points is that the universities where the New Left began and flourished, Madison, Michigan, Berkeley, were also universities that had gotten and were still getting tremendous amounts of federal money for research and development supporting militarism and imperialism that the New Left was opposing. Is this a contradiction, a paradox, or just really a world-class irony?
I don't know which of those it is. I do call it a contradiction in the book for sure, but maybe I use the word paradox as well. I think they're connected. I don't think it's just ironic. I think they are connected to each other, and it's not. I mean, by the end of the 60s, by 1968, by 1969, by 1970, you'll see Students for a Democratic Society flourishing across the country at campuses you just would have never imagined it grabbing a foothold in 3 or 4 or 5 years earlier. The fact that one of the most iconic moments of the 60s takes place at Kent State University in Eastern Ohio is kind of ironic in some ways. But the reality is that the universities, like you mentioned, like Michigan, Berkeley, and Wisconsin, where you first see this surging of new left activity, these new ideas emerging, this activism emerging in the early and middle 1960s. It's not a coincidence that those are also universities that are being financed to a large degree by the federal government and by Cold War related funding. So yeah, the millions of dollars that flow into those universities from the Atomic Energy Commission, from NASA, from the National Science Foundation, from the Department of Defense, really helps to create the foundation for what will later become this movement against those very organizations and policies.
But the students who are here for those departments are not the students that are doing the protests. Those are mainly in the history department and maybe some English majors. So what is the connection between, is it just the growth of the university and the depersonalization of it and the tremendous expansion of the enrollment that creates the critical mass for the development of the politics? Or what is the actual connection between the Cold War university and the anti-war and the development of the anti-war culture?
I think there's at least a couple things. The first is what you mentioned, just the expansion of the university. And, I talk about this quite a bit when I write about the period, the increase in enrollment from maybe 13 or 14,000 in the early 1950s to 35,000 students by the end of the 1960s. And part of that's the baby boom, part of it's other, social factors that are at play, but part of it is the financial commitment of the federal government to these universities, these large research universities. So that's a piece of the story. The other piece of the story is that when the students really, you can go and you can track some of the most important or iconic moments in Madison's history of protest in the 60s, the draft sit-in, Dow, Sterling Hall. Those are connected to the university and its relationship to the federal government, right? Whether that's the draft, whether that's corporations that are doing work for the Defense Department, the Army Math Research Center. So the university itself becomes a target because of its connections to the Cold War, and that drives a lot of this protest.
And on that point, one of the highlights of Jim Rowan's speech at the moratorium day in 1969 in the field house was calling the university an arm of the military-industrial complex.
Absolutely.
And of course, Jim Rowan, when he was with the Daily Cardinal, was the one who wrote the massive exposés of the Army Math Research Center. So when Jim Rowan stands up in front of 15,000 people and condemns the university as an arm of the military-industrial complex, that has a lot of power.
Yeah, Jim Rowan and a few others were engaged in kind of a long-term project in the late 60s to expose the university's connections to the military, to the federal government. As you said, they wrote about the Army Math Research Center, they wrote about ROTC, and they were very explicit in making this argument, for sure.
We're talking with Matthew Levin. His book is Cold War University, Madison and the New Left in the 60s. You mentioned the draft sit-in, and that in fact is the image on the cover of your book, and it's where you begin the introduction. What is it about the draft sit-in in May 1966 that is so important?
Yeah, I chose that as the starting place. You know, it could have started with Dow, could have started with Sterling Hall. There's so many places to kind of jump into the story, but the draft sit-in always stood out to me as I was, you know, doing research and talking to people about this period as kind of the at the center, at the intersection of so many things that were going on, right? It is a peaceful protest. It is somewhat confrontational, right? This is the first time that students engage in a more confrontational direction than they had in the past. So they occupy a campus building for 3 days and 3 nights. They don't disrupt the operations of the building. It's the administration building, the Peterson building, and they negotiate with police, they negotiate with campus officials, they negotiate with faculty members, and it ends peacefully. They finally agree to leave with the promise that the faculty will kind of take up the issues. And so it kind of provides a moment where there was some optimism, but it also kind of foreshadows some of the larger and more and less successful confrontations that would be coming pretty soon.
It was, in fact, popular. I mean, even the regents, the administration thought everyone has handled themselves well. The regents applauded everyone's handling. There was one point where there were some troublemakers inside the administration building, not connected with the protest. They cleared the building. They got rid of the troublemakers, and then the police let the protesters back into the building to keep occupying it. And the Governor Warren Knowles took a hands-off approach, left it to the university, and Robin Fleming and Ralph, the police chief Ralph Hansen, just kept it under control. It really was. It galvanized the campus, and as you say, I think it was one of the high watermarks of the movement. And in fact, I used another picture from the episode on the back of my book when Fred Harvey Harrington, the president of the university, spoke to 8,000 people on the Hill. I mean, that's a remarkable concept of the president coming and talking with the people, with the students, and explaining what was going on.
Agreed. It was for Harrington and for Fleming. It was. It almost seemed like confirmation for them of their approach to student protest and student activism and politics on campus. And it really points to Madison's commitment to those kinds of principles, to the principle of student speech and student protest that went back decades. And for the administration leaders, they saw this as just one more piece of Madison's kind of storied history that they had been involved in. I'm sure they looked back and saw it very differently a year later, but at the time, You're right. I think it was a high point.
Yeah. Of course, the faculty disappointed the students and did not disentangle the university from the draft. We should explain briefly the concept of the protest was they wanted the university to stop complying with the testing and the providing of scores and class rank to the draft to selective service, because that was how the selective service was determining who marginal students were and were calling them up. And the concept of the protesters was to make essentially everybody subject to the draft and not have the deferment for the privileged upper middle class white students, and make the sons and daughters of the upper class subject to the war. And it really was a remarkably selfless thing to say, yes, I want to be exposed to the war as well. And it got a lot of support around the campus.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is in May of 1966. So it's about a year after large numbers of ground troops start to arrive in Vietnam, and the draft calls are increasing. So, you know, students and other young people are obviously very nervous and concerned, and the draft is kind of foremost at this moment. So yeah, they didn't want the university to be involved, and like you said, it was a protest against their own interests in some ways, and they called out the draft system for being racist and classist and privileging certain people. I know the teaching assistants at the time said that they didn't want to participate in assigning grades to people when those grades could potentially affect their draft status.
Right. If you were in the bottom 10% of the class, you were going to get drafted and you were going to get sent to Vietnam. And grades became a literal matter of life and death.
Yeah.
One of the other interesting things is some very prominent people were involved in that. One of the spokesmen for the committee on the university and the draft was Lowell Bergman, who would go on to become, the 60 Minutes producer and one of the great investigative journalists of the time. That's another great thing about books like this, is you see all these future bold-faced names. Oh, I know that person. I know that person.
It's really remarkable. Yeah, if you're a student of Madison history and even national history, when you study this period in Madison, you come across a lot of names that you recognize.
And then, so this is May 1966, and only 4 months later, this is the high point. May 66 is the high point, and 4 months later, we get Evan Stark and Robin David and the Committee to End the War in Vietnam heckling Senator Edward Kennedy off the stage in the Stock Pavilion. And how debilitating, how damaging was that incident to the development of the movement, both in terms of its popular appeal and in terms of its internal dynamics?
Well, it's hard to say how damaging it was, but it was definitely a turning point, in the sense that while everyone could kind of pat themselves on the back for the success of the May draft sit-in, by that fall and the Kennedy debacle, you might say, there was no more, there was no more celebrating. There was no more patting yourself on the back for how wonderful the university had handled all these issues and how wonderfully the students had engaged. So for some students, it was a moment where they, had to make the decision. How do we combat this system that we feel upholds the war in Vietnam, the draft, America's imperialist foreign policy, a lack of civil rights, all these things that they are committed to fighting against. And some of them in the Committee to End the War, as you mentioned, and Stark and is just one of the leaders, decide that, we are going to become more and more confrontational. And you see that really come out at this heckling of Ted Kennedy, who was in town to make a speech. And of course, what it does is it galvanizes not just some of the student radicals who support it, but it galvanizes the opposition. And I think that's probably what you were getting at, Stu. It really gets the faculty, frustrated and upset, and pushes them to take increasingly hardline stances against student disruptions that later on will lead to inviting city police on campus and taking more punitive action against student activism. And it also galvanizes a decent chunk of the university population against, the student population against what's still a relatively small number of activists. So what's amazing is that not just the campus left, as I did research and talked to people, but the conservative elements on campus were also very active during this time period, and not as consistently throughout the whole period, but they were very successful at this moment and at other moments in getting large numbers of people to speak out in opposition to what the campus left was up to.
Yeah, the campus chapter of the Young Americans for Freedom started in 1965, just about the same time as the Committee to End the War in Vietnam did. And its founder was David Keene, who would go on to head the National Rifle Association right. And some other national groups. And just for the historical record, when it comes to disruptions, it was Goldwater conservatives who did the first on-campus disruption of a political meeting when they broke up a Fair Play for Cuba meeting in 1961. So let's not forget that.
All right.
And when you say that, you mentioned that the reaction of the Kennedy created the restrictions. In fact, it was the Kennedy demonstration that directly caused the faculty to impose the rule against disruptions that the administration would enforced by calling in police at Dow. So the way history happens is the Kennedy demonstration leads directly to Dow.
Yeah, the administration was, and the faculty were really embarrassed by the students' treatment of Ted Kennedy, who was an icon. Was the younger brother of President Kennedy, was an icon. And there was a massive effort to ensure that something like this didn't happen again. So yeah, they started to lay down policies. The faculty started to lay down policies to make sure that future, incidents like that wouldn't happen. And yeah, in the fall of 1967, the chancellor at the time, William Sewell, who had just taken over as chancellor a couple months earlier, poor guy, was faced with the Dow demonstration in October of 67. And he, even though he himself was opposed to the war in Vietnam and had spoken at a rally a year or two earlier against the war and signed a petition and those types of things, he was kind of caught in a dilemma where the faculty had spoken and made very clear that they wanted to ensure that regular campus order prevailed and that the chancellor should take whatever action is necessary in order to ensure that.
And in fact, when Sewell was on the faculty, he voted against the rule that he now felt obliged to enforce.
Right.
Sewell is the tragic figure. He's a tragic figure here. Let's pause the late 60s and take a couple steps back into an area that people may be somewhat less familiar with. And it seems to me in reading the book that there's another irony in that Madison's political standing in the 60s is an outgrowth of how progressive and tolerant the administration and even the state legislature were in the 40s and 50s about tolerating communist-affiliated groups, tolerating communist speakers, maybe not tolerating communist faculty, but certainly, but not forcing them to sign loyalty oaths. Talk a bit about the American Youth for Democracy and the Youth Labor League and the situation on campus in the immediate post-war period up to the late 50s.
Yeah, there's, when I wrote the book, I spent quite a bit of time, actually a lot less time on the late 60s, because in some ways that ground has been discussed by so many other people and discussed well. So obviously I wanted to tell that story. I wanted to make those connections, but about half the book is on this period in the 1950s, the post-war years, the early 60s, where much less was happening in terms of kind of dramatic action, the dramatic action that we're so familiar with when we think about the 60s. But yeah, the 1950s were an incredible time in Madison. The university was an interesting place, and this is kind of why this story is so fantastic. Is in some ways Madison is typical, right? It's typical of other large public universities like Berkeley, like Michigan, which I refer to often in the book and kind of compare a little bit. But in some ways, it's very unique because Wisconsin has this progressive culture that comes to us from Robert La Follette and the success of the progressive movement in the early 20th century. Wisconsin has a culture of socialism in Milwaukee and a tolerance for a kind of radical politics that most other parts of the country have no sense of. And the administration at the university has a long history going back to the late 1800s of allowing a political discourse that in some other parts of the country would have been unheard of. And so that carries over into the 1950s, even in the midst of McCarthyism. And of course, everyone who's listening to this knows Joe McCarthy was right here from our own home state up in Appleton. And yet administrators and state legislators here in Madison were willing to give a certain space for dissent and what would otherwise be politically unacceptable speech. They were willing to give room for that on campus. And so you get organizations like American Youth for Democracy, which is the youth group of the Communist Party and is active on campus in the late 40s before it shut down. And the Labor Youth League, AYD ends up getting shut down because of repression at the national level from the federal government. The Labor Youth League replaces it in 1950 and lasts for several years. And at one point, as you mentioned in the introduction, the Labor Youth League here on campus is the only chapter of the organization. There were some chapters that were kind of independent and didn't exist on university campuses, but it was the only university campus chapter that existed for a couple of years in the mid-1950s, because every other university said, we are not interested. They either just kicked them off campus, or the Labor Youth League folded for lack of a faculty advisor, which was required, or the university required them to publish the names of their members, and they folded because the members weren't willing to go public. So, in a remarkable, it's remarkable that the Labor Youth League was able to sustain itself in the middle of the McCarthyist frenzy for a number of years.
You also highlight an episode in January 1953 when they bring the Negro Affairs editor of the Daily Worker, Abner Berry, to campus, and the legislature sets up a alleged council study committee with Warren Knowles, a future governor, a Republican future governor, and to tell us the conclusion after they studied the issue for a year on whether or not they should allow communists to speak on campus.
Yeah, I was really surprised when I went back and did this research on the state legislature's role in some of these things. And like you said, Warren Knowles, a Republican, kind of a traditional conservative, but maybe with a progressive bent. I'm not an expert on Warren Knowles, but the legislature was certainly interested in these issues, and there were some people that spoke out very strongly. So you'll see some of that in my book, where I talk about certain members of the state legislature that were extremely critical of the university. But in this case, this committee basically said, it shrugged its shoulders and said the university can take care of itself and it can figure this out on its own. So it's remarkable in 1953, 54 that the state legislature just down the street from the campus was willing to take that kind of hands-off approach.
That the UW should, quote, continue the present policy of placing no restrictions on freedom of speech or assembly.
Yeah.
And then 15, 16 years later, they're taking a quite different view of affairs on campus. One of the things about McCarthy, even though it's embarrassing that he's from Wisconsin, to a certain extent, it was in the university's favor, because the state of Wisconsin loved its university, and McCarthy had enough sense not to attack the university because A, there were a lot of Republican regents, and B, a lot of alumni. And if he had been the senator from Minnesota and Wisconsin did what it did, he very well may have gone after us the way he didn't, because he represented us.
Absolutely. So yeah, the relationship of Senator McCarthy to the campus is an interesting one. And like you point out, he was reluctant to attack institutions and individuals in Wisconsin because, it might cost him electorally. And so it was much easier to attack the State Department for harboring communists or attack other educational institutions. But he mostly left the university alone, which is kind of another strange irony in the middle of all of this.
You also cite an example in 1962 when the Socialist Club, which we'll talk about in a minute, invites the head of the Communist Party USA, Gus Hall, to speak, and the administration spends a lot of time thinking about it. And the dean of students, Ted Zillman, says, "Well, let the rascal speak." And the irony here is that this is in early 1962, the exact moment that Ted Zillman is purging all the homosexuals out of the University of Wisconsin and conducting what's been called the gay purge. And it's a remarkable convergence of social and political issues that one guy is dealing with a little more successfully on one side than on the other. So we've got the AYD and the LYL, and they fade away, and comes 1959 and the studies on the left. Talk a bit about how important studies on the left was in terms of defining the new left, especially in the context of counterpositioning it to liberalism and where its members then went on to exert influence.
Yes, the Labor Youth League dissolves itself in 1956 or 1957, kind of in reaction to the Soviet invasion of Hungary, which a lot of American communists were kind of aghast about, and also the emergence of truth or facts about how Stalin had, operated for all those decades. So in its place emerges kind of a more loose left on campus, less tied down to old left organizations. And out of that comes some new campus organizations and Studies on the Left, as you said, started in 1959. And Studies on the Left is really a project of a group of graduate history students and a few other graduate students kind of in other parts of the university, an English graduate student or two. And they put together this journal. It's kind of an audacious move, right? To make the claim that they are going to redefine what the left means, and that they are going to try to create a new direction on the left. And yeah, one of the things that they're most known for is their approach to liberalism. And this is something that I found really interesting as I kind of looked at the early history of SDS, which is of course the most well-known organization during the 1960s. And its famous Port Huron statement is kind of the manifesto of this movement in some ways. But the Port Huron statement is a little bit wishy-washy when it comes to liberalism. It's not willing to call out liberalism for its failures. It seems to hold out hope that liberalism will come around. Whereas Studies on the Left is engaging in a critique of liberalism that's really powerful. And they're going after Woodrow Wilson, for example. They're going after Franklin Roosevelt. I mean, these are the heroes of American liberalism, and they're attacking them for their foreign policy, for being in bed with American corporate interests. And the journal kind of coins the phrase corporate liberalism to describe a liberalism that has been co-opted by American corporations, that is committed to American capitalism, to American foreign policy, and basically argues that it's not the conservatives that are the problem, it's the liberals that are the problem. The Cold War is their doing, not the conservatives.
It was the brilliant Marty Sklar who coined that phrase, corporate liberalism, sort of combining corporate capitalism and American liberalism, and denouncing the whole deal. Critique of the Cold War brings us back to the history department and William Appleman Williams. You mentioned the role of history students in Studies on the Left. You came here for the history department. It's been nationally renowned since Frederick Jackson Turner in the 1890s. By the 1960s, we've got George Mossey and Merle Curdy and the dynamic and flamboyant Harvey Goldberg, and of course, William Appleman Williams. You cite an amazing statistic that in the fall of '61, a full 25% of the student body was taking at least one history course. So it obviously had a tremendous influence. Why was Bill Williams, above all, so important?
Yeah, I mean, there are so many faculty members that we could talk about and their roles. And that's one of the things that makes Madison a special place in the 60s. And people who were here during that time period oftentimes talk about some of their professors. But William Appleman Williams was not just another inspirational professor. He articulated a critique of American foreign policy, American imperialism, American capitalism that was incredibly influential. It affected the editors of Studies on the Left. Later on, as the Vietnam War starts to become a major issue, Williams is, his critiques almost seems to be proven right as America struggles in another part of the world to exert its imperialist, as he would call it, its imperialist reach. So for a lot of students, Williams, who had a national impact as well. He wasn't just a Madison figure, but for a lot of students in Madison, he was incredibly influential in kind of persuading them that his view of the world made sense. His critique of American imperialism is basically serving the interests of American capitalist corporations, and that America wasn't the hero in this Cold War narrative. So at this time in the 1950s, Cold War or historians were almost unanimous in their support of the Cold War, in their support of America's destiny, exceptionalism. And Bill Williams was one of the few historians who was starting to counter that. And of course, his view of the Cold War has now become, much more accepted today. And we see his perspective as part of the mainstream in a way that it wasn't all those years ago.
But one wonders what he would think of Russian imperialism today.
That's absolutely. He wasn't. He would have called himself. Or I don't know if he would have called himself a socialist or not. But he definitely was a socialist of one form or another. His hero was Eugene Debs. It wasn't Joseph Stalin, and he certainly would be. He certainly didn't think the Soviet Union was a utopia. And he certainly wouldn't look at Russian imperialism today as a positive either, I'm sure.
We're talking with Matthew Levin. His book is Cold War University, Madison and the New Left in the 60s. We got about 10 minutes left, Matt. Everyone remembers Harvey Goldberg as this romantic, flamboyant man of great rhetoric and great passion, but his field was European history and the French Revolution. As you look at influence, was Bill Williams actually more influential to student activists than Harvey Goldberg was?
I guess it depends what time period you're talking about. So, Williams is gone by, I think it's the spring of 1968 is the end of his tenure in Madison. And Goldberg becomes more popular at that time, in the very late 60s and into the 1970s. So it might depend on what time period you're talking about. If you're talking about the early period and kind of this smaller group of radicals who are involved in the Socialist Club or the Student Peace Center or studies on the left, I think Williams was more influential. If you're talking about the late 60s and kind of the more dramatic moments of the late 60s, I think Goldberg was more suited to that moment. He seemed to enjoy I don't know if enjoy is the right word, but he seemed to fit right in some ways with the activism, the passion, the excitement of those years.
So here's another profound irony. It was Fred Harvey Harrington, as chair of the history department and later president, who hired Mossy and Williams and Goldberg, and was their students who led the movement that would eventually end his presidency. It's one of those. It's almost Shakespearean in its sweep. We've got a couple minutes left. You mentioned the Student Peace Center and the Socialist Club. You want to say just a brief bit about them before we talk briefly about civil rights?
Yeah, absolutely. These are a couple of organizations that kind of emerged in the middle and late 50s. The Socialist Club emerges as kind of a non-sectarian organization, meaning it's not committed to the communist line like the Labor Youth League had been, even though a lot of members of the Socialist Club were former members of the Labor Youth League. The Student Peace Center actually is interesting. By 1960, it would be kind of taken over by Socialist Club types. But when it was founded in the mid-1950s, in 1955, it was actually founded by Christian students on campus who drew their inspiration from their Christian background, not from radical politics or the old left or anything like that. So it was a small group of students associated with the Quakers who started the Student Peace Center. So those were a couple of the organizations that kind of kept alive this space for people who wanted to dissent from the Cold War orthodoxy of those years. and would play an important role in studies on the left and in some of the future movements that came about.
And in fact, it was the Student Peace Center where Evan Stark got his start. Evan Stark, who would be the great polemicist that would lead to Dow, writing the critical handout, now we must act. He got his, and also the Kennedy demonstration, he got his start in the Student Peace Center. We got a couple minutes left. The anti-war movement, of course, did not spring out of nowhere, but was a direct successor to the civil rights movement, both in terms of tactics and personnel. Briefly survey the heyday of the movement 60-65, which ends just as the war is heating up.
Yeah. I write a little bit about, it's not, at the center of the story that I tell, but it's obviously of interest to me. And of importance to the story of Madison is the history of Black students on campus, of civil rights activism amongst both Black and white students, of Madison's Black community. And there is activism in the 1950s, and certainly interest connected to events taking place elsewhere in the country. Of course, students are interested in the Montgomery bus boycott. They're interested in the Brown decision in 1954, but it's really the 1960 SitIn movement that changes the campus movement, that really impacts young people. And that's the SitIn movement that started in North Carolina, where a group of young African-American folks sat down at a series of lunch counters starting in Greensboro, North Carolina, and refused to get up until they were served. And it was just a dramatic moment that captured the energy of young people at the time, and immediately it could be felt in Madison, immediately. So, protests in the 1950s on campus were few and far between, but in 1960, immediately you get students picketing outside of downtown chain stores. You get a rally on the steps of the Wisconsin Historical Society in March of 1960. You get a march a couple months later, and with hundreds of people involved, with political figures. The governor comes and speaks at one of these, and it's really an amazing moment where all of a sudden there's an energy that just had not existed before, and the civil rights movement really galvanized that. And you see more and more of that, right? The famous civil rights figures coming to campus. Those are kind of the major draws in terms of campus speakers in the early 60s. And then ultimately, even events like the Freedom Rides and Freedom Summer, where some students in Madison participate directly and are impacted on a whole nother level by the civil rights movement, by their direct involvement, to then come back to campus and bring those organizational techniques, that passion, that energy, that experience. And yeah, it's hard to, when we talk about the 60s, we talk about the civil rights movement, we talk about the counterculture, we talk about the anti-war movement, but in reality, it's really tough to separate these out because they overlapped in so many ways.
Because you see people like Paul Brynas going to become a freedom rider and going to Parchment Farm, or Stu Ewan, or Bob Gabriner and Vicki Gabriner going to Freedom Summer, and then carrying that through both in terms of anti-war protest and countercultural activity, doing things like starting connections and just there's a continuous line. One thing about that rally in March of 1960 on the Library Mall, the organizers wanted to have that as a march up State Street, but the administration said no, opposed it, and the organizers turned to the WSA Student Senate and said, we'll do whatever you want. If you endorse a march, we'll march, and if you say no, we'll only have a rally. And the concept of radical organizers deferring to student government, that's another little bit of history that I don't think would repeat itself today.
No, it's funny reading the stories about those early protests or rallies, and there was all this disagreement about whether a rally or a protest made more sense and which one would be more likely to create opposition. And the whole discussion is kind of comedic, right?
And then 9 years later, to complete the arc of civil rights in the decade, we got the Black Studies strike, which tries to shut the campus down, occasions the first visit by the National Guard, but turns out to be the most successful political protest of the decade because it achieved its primary objective. It got one of the first full degree granting departments of Afro-American studies in the country, even before Harvard. And that's another important takeaway, that a Black organized, Black conducted strike on this campus was so successful.
Yeah, it's another, going back to our discussion at the very beginning, talking about the connections between the 60s and today. The Black strike is an obvious one. In February of 1969, the National Guard coming onto campus, this multiracial coalition, although organized and conducted, as you said, by the Black student organizations. You know, some of their demands were not met. They wanted full control over this new department. They wanted the ability to hire and fire, and the faculty was never going to give them that. But you're right. They actually attain some of their real goals, as opposed to the Dow demonstration, which never succeeded in stopping interviews, or the draft SitIn, which didn't stop the university from cooperating with the draft. So in some ways, yeah, you could make an argument that that it was the most successful.
And some of the tactics they used of blocking streets and blocking buildings would a generation later be denounced by people who had participated in some of those. It's where you stand depends on where you sit, and people who are in a position of power in the 80s and 90s and the aughts would be opposing those same tactics that they had employed in the 60s and early 70s. We got just about a minute left. Who do you wish you could have interviewed that you weren't able to because they were gone or passed away?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I listened to so many interviews and I talked to a number of people. I never did track down like Bob Cohen or Evan Stark. Yeah. And I kind of wish I had. I gave a lot of my attention to the earlier era, the 50s, in terms of my interviews, but they would have been interesting to talk to for sure.
Well, I'll tell you, Evan Stark writes very long emails. I will share some with you for your next book. That is all the time we have. My thanks to Matt Levin. Again, the book is Cold War University, Madison and the New Left. Next week, Bill Christopherson, author of The Man from Clear Lake, Earth Day founder, Senator Gaylord Nelson. 2 book events to tell you about this week, both Thursday night at 7 via Crowdcast, a very big Wisconsin Book Festival event, Sir Salman Rushdie presenting his new novel, Quixote, his unique reading of the Cervantes classic. You can find more details at wisconsinbookfestival.org. And also Thursday night, a virtual book launch for a local author hosted by